After 9 long months, I have finally finished my textual criticism experiment, and now in this video, I'm going to be sharing the results with you. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Gospel Training Ground. My name is Ryan Haines, and I'm here to help you live out your Christian faith in our post-Christian culture. And today I'm super excited because today I'm going to be sharing with you the final results of my textual criticism experiment. But before I get started with explaining this experiment and how it all worked and how it all turned out, I wanted to let you guys know that every single document that I used in this experiment, including the base text, the original text, the reconstructed text, and all of the manuscripts that I used in this experiment, all of that stuff is available for you to download online through my website, thegospeltrainingground.com. And the reason I'm making all this available is, well, because you asked me to. A bunch of people have been asking that I could make PDFs of these things available for them to be able to look at as well. It's good for transparency and honesty's sake so that you can check out my work for me. And I also think it'd be a really great way for you to be able to get some hands-on experience with textual criticism by you yourself going through these manuscripts and trying to figure it out on your own as well. I also think it would be a great activity or something that you could do for a small group at your church or maybe the youth group at your church, just to give people a better understanding of what textual criticism is by having them actually do it and work on reconstructing the text of a document. So again, all of this is available for you to download on my website, and the link for that is in the description box below. But now, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and give an overview of this experiment, how it all worked, and then finally give you the results as to how it all turned out. So, why did I do the textual criticism experiment? Well, simply put, the purpose of the textual criticism experiment is to help people understand the validity of New Testament textual criticism. And textual criticism is a very broad field of scholarship, and essentially the goal of textual criticism is to compare copies of a document in order to determine the original wording of that document when the original document no longer exists. And this is practiced by scholars of pretty much every ancient writing, because any writing from like the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century or even earlier than that, we don't have the original of that document. And so scholars have to work through the copies of those documents in order to determine the original reading. And this is also true for the New Testament. We do not have the original writings of Paul or James or Peter or John. And so what we have are copies of their writings, over 5,000 copies of their writings. And since these copies were made by hand, these copies include mistakes and spelling errors and grammatical issues and even intentional changes done by scribes. And so scholars of the New Testament also have to engage in textual criticism by sorting through the differences they find in the Greek manuscripts in order to determine the original wording of the New Testament. And although we have a great deal of certainty in what the New Testament said because of textual criticism, we don't actually have the originals to compare them to. And so my goal in this experiment was to take a document and put it through a copying process that was something similar to how the documents of the New Testament would have been copied, and then using only the copies of that document, attempting to reconstruct the original wording of that document, and then finally comparing my reconstructed text to the original text in order to see how accurate it really was. And so therefore, this is the thesis of my experiment. I believe that when a document is copied successively through multiple lines of transmission, I can accurately reconstruct the wording of that document using only imperfect copies of that document. So that's the stated thesis for the experiment, and in this video I'm going to be showing you whether or not that thesis was proven true. But before I get into the results of this experiment, I want to make two things very, very clear. First of all, I want to make it clear that this experiment does not in and of itself prove the reliability of the New Testament text. Honestly, there's no way this experiment could do that, and the reason why is because the copying process in my experiment is not a direct parallel to the copying process of the New Testament, and the issues involved in my experiment are also not a direct parallel to the issues that were involved in the copying of the New Testament. Honestly, it would be impossible for anybody to perfectly replicate the copying of the New Testament. So don't go around telling people that this experiment proves that the New Testament is reliable, because this experiment can't do that and it won't do that. Rather, the purpose of this experiment is to help people understand that the principles involved in New Testament textual criticism criticism are valid, and therefore we can have a great deal of certainty as to what the New Testament says. So really this experiment is more about textual criticism than it is about the New Testament, and so I just wanted to make that clear to clarify. And so now the second thing that I want to make clear is that this experiment is not about how we got our English Bibles. Our English Bibles are translated from a Greek text, and textual criticism is interested in evaluating Greek manuscripts in order to determine the actual original wording of the Greek text from which our English Bibles are translated. And since most people, like myself, are not able to read ancient Greek, I decided to do this experiment in normal English so that non-Greek speaking people would be able to have a better idea as to what scholars deal with when they do textual criticism of the Greek manuscripts. But once a Greek text is established, there are other issues involved with translation and translation philosophies, and that all goes into translating the Greek text into our English Bibles, and dealing with those issues of translation philosophy is simply beyond the scope of this experiment because it's all done in one language. And so I just say all this so that you don't misapply this experiment and think that this experiment is capable of doing more than it's actually capable of. Again, this experiment is simply about helping people understand the reliability of the principles that are involved in New Testament textual criticism. So now let's talk about my method, like how I actually did this experiment. First, you need to understand that in order to do textual criticism, you first need handwritten copies of a document. And that means that I needed a copying process, or what's known as a transmission of the text. So I tried to reproduce on a much smaller scale something that's somewhat similar to what the New Testament went through in terms of how it was copied and transmitted throughout history. And so what I tried to replicate was random copying being done through multiple lines of transmission. Now let me explain what that means by pulling up my transmission chart here. So what you see on the screen here is my textual transmission chart, and this is meant to show how the document, the original document, was copied. So at the top, obviously you see in the black box, it says the original document. That represents the original. That original document was then copied 4 times. That's why you see 4 circles coming off from that box, and every circle on this chart represents a copy that was made, and the lines connecting the circles show which copies were made from which other copies. So as you can see, again, the original document copied 4 times, and then those 4 first copies create the basis for a line of transmission. Right? You see line 1, line 2, line 3, and line 4. So each of those first 4 copies were then copied 3 times and then sort of randomly copied from there. And I intentionally made it so that the copying process of line 1 was different from the copying of line 2 and line 3 and line 4. As you can see, they don't all follow the same pattern of copying going on there. And so within each of these 4 lines of transmission, there are 5 phases of copying, representing the earliest copies to the later copies, from the earliest being from phase 1, then from phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, and phase 5. Now, you're also probably wondering why it is that some of these circles are black, some of these circles are white, and some of these circles are half black and half white. Well, the reason for this is because in the New Testament, we have what you could call imperfect lines of transmission. And when I say that, I mean that we don't have every single manuscript that was ever made of the New Testament, okay? And so the black circles represent manuscripts that I discarded. They no longer exist. I actually destroyed them completely. The white circles represent manuscripts that I used the entirety of, okay, because there are full manuscripts of the New Testament that we do have. Now, the circles that are half black and half white represent what could be called fragmentary manuscripts, meaning they only exist in part. Maybe a page is missing, or a portion of the page is missing, or a corner was ripped off, or something like that. But either way, these manuscripts there's only a portion of them that still exists, and so I also wanted to have manuscripts where I only used a portion of them. And if you want to see how it was I created these fragmentary manuscripts, well, this is how I did it. And there goes the first paragraph. This is a 2-page copy, so 1 page is gone. And as far as the other page is concerned, that's what it's going to look like. And now let's mix things up a little bit. Wow! Let's do it again. Wow, look at that. And one more time. Whoa! And maybe just a few more little tears here and there. Just a few more little rips in the page. And that's a good looking manuscript. Man, this one actually looks like it was very well written. See ya. So that was fun. But anyway, back to the transmission chart. Now the last thing I want to make clear about this transmission chart and what it's meant to help people see is that the vast majority of the material that I was using in my reconstruction process, in my textual criticism for this experiment, came later on, in the later phases of copying, and I did that on purpose because most of the material that we have that still exists of the Greek New Testament manuscripts comes from later periods of history. Okay, there are some manuscripts that are very, very early, but we know one thing for sure, that we don't have originals, and we probably don't have copies of the originals, although maybe it's a possibility, but it's very, very unlikely. And so I chose to try to replicate that by getting rid of all the first copies that were made, and then only using fragmentary copies from the second phase of copying, and then only in the third phase of copying do I start getting complete manuscripts, and then I start getting a few more in the fourth phase, and then a few more in the fifth phase. And so I did that on purpose to replicate the same position that New Testament scholars are in, because the further back they go, the closer they get to the original documents, the less amount of information they have to work with. And so I wanted to put myself in the exact same situation. So overall, this was the manuscript data that I was working with. 17 of the manuscripts were missing and non-existent. I did not use them at all. 12 of those manuscripts were fragmentary, and 23 of them were complete or full manuscripts. And this basically means that I was using about 55% of the total information that was produced in the copying process for my experiment. I was really only using about half of the total information available. And again, most of the information that I'm using, most of that 55%, comes from the later phases of copying. And so that is comparable to the New Testament, that the bulk of what we have comes from later generations of copying. And so once I figured out how it was I wanted this document to be copied, the next step was to find 52 volunteers to actually make these copies for me. And by the way, thank you so much to everyone who gave their time to make a copy for me. But here's the thing, the New Testament text went through both accidental and intentional changes as scribes made their copies, and I needed to ensure that my document went through those same type of changes during my transmission and copying process. And so each of the scribes got an envelope from me with the copy that they were going to be copying from in that envelope, and also a set of instructions. And that set of instructions basically just told them, copy this document by hand and don't worry about any mistakes that you made, just leave them, don't try to correct them. And the reason I did that is because I wanted accidental mistakes to be in my manuscripts. I wanted to deal with them. But I also needed intentional mistakes to be in my manuscripts. And so what I did was, in each line of transmission, I randomly chose several envelopes to slip a special set of instructions into. And in that special set of instructions, I told them, you have my permission to intentionally change the text however you want to. They were allowed to take things out, they could reword things, they could rephrase things, they could add their own ideas into it. Literally, they could do whatever they wanted to the text. And so this left me with a bunch of corrupted manuscripts in which none of them had the exact same wording, and that is the exact same situation that New Testament scholars are in with the New Testament manuscripts. And then once I got all of my manuscripts back, I chose one complete manuscript to be my base text. And a base text is simply a text that you choose for comparison's sake so that you can count variants. And what this means is that every single time one of the other manuscripts differed from the base text in its wording, then I would count that as a textual variant, and I recorded it and logged it in my computer. And after I went through all the manuscripts and compared every single sentence in every manuscript to the base text, I found a grand total of 396 textual variants in my manuscripts. And I broke that up into two separate categories of both meaningful variants and non-meaningful variants. A meaningful variant is one that actually changes the meaning of the text, meaning when you read it, you're going to come to a different conclusion based upon this variant. And non-meaningful variants variants were ones that were essentially insignificant to the meaning of the text. It didn't change how the reader understood the story at all. And so I ended up having 143 meaningful variants and 253 non-meaningful variants. And once I counted and cataloged all the textual variants that I could find, I went back through all of those variants and attempted to reconstruct what I believed the original text to be. All right, so this is the moment y'all been waiting for. Let's talk about the results of this experiment. So this right here is my reconstructed text. This is what I came up with after sorting through all the variants and looking through all the manuscripts. As you can see, it says the parking challenge, the reconstructed text. This was a title that someone gave it in one of the manuscripts. They called it the parking challenge because it's about a guy who's learning how to drive with his dad. But anyway, this is the reconstructed text that I had right here. This is the original that I printed out after completing this, and this was the first time I ever read the original was when I compared it to the reconstructed text. And when I did, I found not one single difference in the wording. Literally, the only difference I found between the reconstructed text and the original text were differences in punctuation, differences in the paragraph breaks, and differences in capitalization. But here's the thing, none of those things in any way changed the meaning or the wording of what was written. And so this means that the experiment was a success. I did successfully, accurately, I would even say perfectly, reconstructed the text of an original document based on only imperfect copies of this original document. So I'm like pumped about this. This is awesome. So now I just want to kind of go through and explain a little bit more as to how I went about reconstructing this and why it is I think that I ended up making the right decisions in determining the readings. So remember, there were 396 textual variants that I found in my manuscripts, but let me break that down a little bit for you. Only 24 of those variants, or you could think of it as 6% of those variants, were considered viable variants. So again, there were 396 textual variants that I found in my manuscripts. But here's the thing, only 24, or you could think of it as 6%, only 6% of those textual variants were viable. And what that means is that a viable variant is one that actually has a chance of being original, meaning that based upon the manuscript evidence, there's some good reason for thinking that this might have been what was originally written. But here's the thing, it gets even better. Of those 24 viable variants, only 2 of them were meaningful. This means that the vast majority of all my meaningful variants that actually impacted the meaning of the text somehow were not viable, meaning they had no chance of actually being original. This means that only 2 of the meaningful variants that I found that actually changed the meaning of the story and changed the meaning of the text, only 2 of them were viable, which means that most of the meaningful variants that I found, it was super easy to recognize that, whoa, there's no way this is original. This was a mistake, this was added in, and I could pick that up because of the manuscript evidence. And since only 2 of those 24 variants were meaningful, that means that only 0.5% of all the textual variants that I found were meaningful and viable. But thankfully, due to the multiple lines of transmission and the overabundance of manuscript evidence, I had no problem determining what the original reading was, even when I was dealing with meaningful textual variants. And now, before I go through and show you some examples of some of these variants and how I decided what the reading should be, I just wanted to point out that even though the statistics are not exactly the same, this is comparable to the New Testament. Because with the New Testament, the vast majority of the variants that we have are not meaningful. And of those meaningful variants, most of them are not viable. This means that there's really only like a handful of places in the New Testament where scholars are not 100% sure about the reading of a certain text, and that in those places it actually has some impact on the meaning of that text. And furthermore, it should be pointed out that no essential doctrine of Christianity hinges on any of those textual variants. And so this means that the text of the New Testament has been preserved with remarkable accuracy. And not only that, but the message of Christ and the apostles has remained intact throughout history. And this is actually one of the things that I learned that was so neat in this experiment, is the importance of having multiple lines of transmission, both in the New Testament and with my experiment. Because if I only had the manuscripts from line 1 to work with, I would come up with something very, very different than if I only had the manuscripts to work with from line 2. And same way, I'd come up with something different than if I only had the manuscripts from line 3 or line 4, because each of the lines of transmission had their own unique readings and developments that happened and changes and alterations that happened within that line of transmission. And so not only would a reconstructed text based on individual lines be different from each other, but each one of those would also be very different from the original text. But the fact that I was able to compare all 4 lines of transmission together, it allowed me to see with great clarity those issues that developed in the individual lines and weed those out as being, no way that was original. But when I was able to compare all the lines of transmission, the errors that developed in each individual line became abundantly clear, and it made it so much easier to reconstruct the original text accurately. But anyway, back to my experiment here. So again, I found 24 viable textual variants in my manuscripts, and of those 24 viable variants, in those 24 cases, 21 of those cases, I chose a reading that differed from the base text. And in each of these areas, I had to make a decision based upon the manuscript evidence as to which reading I was going to go with as original. But check this out. If there was any hesitation at all in my mind about what the reading should be, I put the other possible reading in a footnote of my reconstructed text, just like in our Bibles, as you can see on the screen here. The top of the screen shows the footnotes in my reconstructed text. There's 4 of them on the front page, 2 more on the back page, so a total of 6 footnotes that I ended up having where I thought it could have been one reading or another, but the less likely choice was put here in the footnote. And then on the bottom of the screen you have a picture of the footnotes in my Bible, and this is at the bottom of the page for Romans chapter 5, and as you can see, there's 2 footnotes there that say some manuscripts say let us, and the second one says some manuscripts omit by faith, and the reason why is because there are some viable textual variants in Romans chapter 5, and so Bible translators put those other possible readings down in the footnotes for us to understand. And now just really quick, I'm going to give you a few examples. I want to talk to you about one of the meaningful variants that I found that actually was not viable at all. It was 2 sentences that were omitted in the base text and actually omitted in pretty much all of line number 4, but they were found in the other 3 lines of transmission. Not always fully. There were a few spots where one part of the sentence was gone, or one of the sentences of the 2 sentences was gone, but all of the other 3 lines of transmission testified to those 2 sentences in one way or another and in some capacity. And so I went with those 2 sentences and realized, man, if 3 of those lines of transmission have it and the 4th one does it, I'm going to assume that that was original. And so I did include it in there, and to my joy, that's exactly what it said in the original text as well. And now to end, I just want to show you what was probably the most difficult and tricky textual variant that I found and show you how I worked through it. It was the 3rd textual variant in sentence number 41. So let me pull some stuff up on the screen here for you. So at the top of the screen here, you see a picture of the base text where this variant occurs in sentence 41. And then at the bottom of the screen, you see manuscript 4.5a, where this textual variant also occurs. And so you're going to see the difference in the wording here, that in the base text, the sentence says, right back to where we'd started. We apostrophe D, meaning where we had started, right, with just the contraction going on there. In the manuscript on the bottom of the screen, it does not have that contraction. It simply says right back to where we started. Now here's the crazy thing about this. The way that it reads in the base text, about half of the manuscripts read that way. The way that it reads in manuscript 4.5a without the contraction, about half of the manuscripts read it that way. And so there was no overwhelming manuscript evidence for one reading or another. Both of these readings are found very early, and both of these readings are found in a lot of manuscripts. So since the manuscript evidence wasn't very conclusive, I thought about the internal evidence. Grammatically, does one of them make more sense than another? And really, they both work, and so there's really, from the internal evidence perspective, not conclusive evidence one way or another. So I was left kind of wondering, shoot, what do I do with this? But I remembered that one of the principles in New Testament textual criticism and textual criticism as a whole is that you should choose the reading that best explains the rise of the other readings. And so I started thinking to myself, okay, well, what would make more sense? Would it make more sense if the original said weed with the apostrophe D and that people just left that off and forgot about it? Or would it make more sense that it originally did not have the contraction, and a bunch of people just added it on. And I realized it was far more likely for more people to make the common mistake of leaving the apostrophe D off than it would be likely for many, many people to make the same mistake of adding the apostrophe D on. And so ultimately, I did choose to go with the reading that had the apostrophe D instead of leaving out the apostrophe D, but I left in the bottom of the page a footnote that said some manuscripts say we instead of weed with the apostrophe D. And so I left it there, and when I compared it to the original, I realized that, hey, the original had the apostrophe D in it. And so again, the principles of textual criticism proving themselves to be valid and true because they helped me make the right decision in that instance. So that's it. Pretty cool, right? There's so much more that I could probably talk about, but I don't want to make this video too long. But I want to summarize by just saying that the experiment was a success. And so I ask that you could please share this video with anyone else who you think might be interested in learning more about textual criticism and learning more about this experiment that I did. And again, just a final reminder that all the documents that I used in this experiment, including all of the manuscripts, the reconstructed text, the base text, and the original document, are all available on my website for you to download so that you and your friends can get some hands-on experience with textual criticism.